School Board Work Session, March 3rd, 2025.
Good afternoon. The time is now 4:01. The Wayzata Public Schools Board of Education work session for Monday, March 3rd, 2025 will please come to order. Let's go around the table for introductions. We'll start from my left this time.
Oh, me,
Sarah.
not Dr. Anderson. He's at your left. Sarah Johansson.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Valentina Ayers.
Paras Bhinde.
Throw everybody off, right?
Dan Ginestra.
Sheila Pryor.
Heidi Cater.
Chase Anderson.
And I'm Milind Sohoni. Thank you, everyone. As a reminder, the board does not vote on any item at the work session. This afternoon, we have 2 items on the agenda. I just want to make a brief announcement, something that I think we should all be proud of. Congratulations to Marcus Westman, the Wayzata High School Student Council President, who was just announced as the winner of the National Association of Secretaries of State. He just got the John Lewis Award for Youth Leadership. I'm sure we'll hear about that in the next meeting, but congratulations to Marcus. All right, first we have a finance and operations report, and Executive Director Scott Lesage will present the 2024-25 revised budget. Scott.
All right, I got a couple people joining me here too, so I know they rushed up here because they're excited to be here, so I'm just kidding. I guess just real quick introductions. I've got Jen Welk here to my right. She's our student accounting manager and finance manager, and we've got David Draskovich to my left, and he's our director of finance for the district. And of course, I'm Scott Lesage, executive over finance and operations. So thank you, Board Chair Sohoni, members of the board. I know I am always famous for this, but I really don't think this will be too long of a presentation. Everybody that sits on my committee meetings is laughing right now, but I really do believe that. So as you recall, the revised budget, this is the time of the year where we get to kind of do a little bit of reconciliation on our prelim budget. If you recall, when we presented the preliminary budget to the board back in June, that was work that was done starting in February, March, April, and May. So there's a lot of unknowns at that point, and we used a lot of estimates, a lot of projected information, and then now we kind of are able to reconcile that and put the numbers more in line with where we believe they'll end up. So, all right. So today we'll go over kind of the background information along with some assumptions that go into the creation of the prelim budget. And then we'll look at the preliminary budget. That will be a comparative item that we presented back in June. And then we'll review the following Fund 1 budget for the general fund as the revised. You will notice a lot of these slides are kind of repetition, and board members, I know you're getting familiar with that, but it's on purpose. It's just kind of a good reminder. You'll also notice some similar slides with updated information because we feel it's really important to talk about the whole experience the district's gone through. If you looked at it just at a point in time right now, you might think, wow, this is incredible. Things are going really well. I would say kind of our story is pretty unique in Wayzata, even compared to a lot of places across the state due to the pandemic. We were impacted pretty tremendously by it, and I would say we were impacted very uniquely compared to a lot of districts around the state. So I think it's important to kind of tell the whole story. So I won't bore you with all the details because you've seen a lot of that. This presentation obviously is available right now, and it will go onto the district website, as have the other ones as well, for the public to view. Just so how we always kind of start out the government structure, I just like to list these because it's really important to recognize that there's different funds inside of the district. The one that we're covering today is just the general fund, but it's important to note that like our food service fund, community service, building construction, and debt service, those are all different funds and they all have their own unique rules. And then just refresher on the fund balance categories. Obviously restricted, we hear about those often as well. Operating capital, capital projects levy, LTFM is a big one that you guys have gotten familiar with. And then non-spendables, those are kind of your non-cash ones, the prepaid and the inventories. Assigned, just a few of those listed there are QComp and then some other assigned funds that we have based on our last audit. And then the one that everybody kind of pays attention to and really focuses on is the unassigned. And that's for obvious reason, because those are the dollars the district can kind of utilize as it sees fit, as the board sees fit. All right, the timeline, I just like to keep this up here, and it does get modified, admittedly, because as we go through the year, sometimes there's some unknowns. So we like to try to stick to timeframes as much as we can, but we also are kind of working around a lot of unknowns, and we like to get as close as we can to the information. So as you'll see there, this is kind of the point of the year where we would bring the revised budget to you. One thing I didn't say on the front end is obviously this is just a presentation today, so we're not asking for any board action. That would be next Monday. So board would feel free to reach out to all three of us with any questions. All right, so just very familiar slides, but I think this is always important because obviously we have expenditures as a district, and we are a pupil-driven revenue system. So can be a very vicious thing and it can be a very great thing. So we've seen both within a 4-year period, right, as a school district. So you can see for the current fiscal year, we're at 2% growth. Board Chair Sohoni and I were just talking about the formula for next year. The increase will be 2.74%. So as you recall with the legislative session, year one was 4%. This year was back down to 2%, and we just found out that it was going to be 2.74% for next year. So that is exciting. All that said, we all know that our expenditures are a lot more than that, and our expenditures continue to outpace our revenues. I like this slide. I didn't want to take this one out because I think it does a pretty incredible job of showing just where we would be if our funding model had kept up with inflation over the years. This is an updated slide from Ehlers and Associates, our partners. And you can see on the top right there, the updated number. But if you take that updated number, which is 8,645, subtract that by the allowance that we're getting in the current fiscal year, which is 7,281, and then multiply that 7,281 by the number of students that we have increased for the revised budget. You can see right there, you land on that 93 million. And now if you take that same math, but apply the 8,600, you can see the difference there. So, and that's just 1 year. So that isn't compounded year over year, that's just 1 year. So that shows you what a big impact that has, and I'm assuming over that same time frame, our costs did not decrease or only stay at that. So I just think that's something important to point out. Luckily, we are in an environment where we are seeing big student growth again. And I don't think we should shy away from the fact that that is kind of the savior for us, if you will, because if you're in a district that has flat or declining enrollment, I mean, just the quick numbers we went over on the math, it's not a very sustainable model. So that's where you're looking at cuts every 3 to 5 years. So I know David and I and Jen talking with our colleagues, they're going through cuts. So, and I think we are also, and we'll touch on this, but we were lucky we got ahead of it when we did. And board members, if you have questions at any point, please feel free to interrupt. I keep this on here too, just because this is a budget presentation, and I know really the core kind of guts of the presentation is right at the end when you're looking at, oh, where are we gonna end up? But these are all components that go into it. So the levy revenue reminder, just pointing out here that a lot of times people say, geez, there's more houses going up, that's more money for the district. That's not necessarily a true statement. So it just gets spread out. So we've gone over this slide several times, but I like to keep it in here just to kind of show that, because I think that's a misconception that we all hear a lot of times. So, and this is one I just added. This is a slide that David and I got this fall from PMA, and I just have this on here just to show kind of where we sit on a levy tax comparison to other West Metro districts. And you can see there, I don't know if I have a pointer on this, but I should have put my famous yellow arrow. But if you look down, we're right underneath the red state average. And if you look all the way over to your right, you can see we sit at that 26-21. And then you can see below that kind of where our neighbors around us sit. So I just thought that was kind of a good comparative slide. All right, revised general fund assumptions. I won't go deep into this, but I'll just highlight a lot of them. So kind of the one big thing that we're all paying attention to is obviously enrollment, right? We're a pupil-driven revenue system, so we are always watching that because we want to be conservative and we want to really be aware of where we think these counts are going to come in. We're also in a very unique situation because we, as the board knows, we just went through a demographic and capacity study. So we are seeing pretty tremendous growth. We're continuing to see that. And so we have increased on our prelim budget. We used an enrollment of 12,684. We have increased that to 12,760 students. You might ask yourself, well, Scott, what do you mean? I just saw the enrollment report that Jen Welk sent. It's higher than that. Well, that's based on, we're using what we think it'll end up for ADM. So that count, like if you look at a count today, Jen, what was the count today? I don't remember.
12,847.
And so, thank you. And so I feel bad Jen gets bothered all the time with that. I think I said it at many meetings, but I think this summer Chase and I were bugging Jen on a daily basis. Yep, I'm pretty sure we were. And so, and I'm pretty sure David did too. But that is looking at the count right now. So we're paid on the average daily membership. So as like a kid that starts right now, that is prorated. So we don't get the full 1.0 of the pupil unit. And so we get a portion of that. And so by us using 12,760, that kind of accounts for the kids that started later because we are picking up, for a while, what were we picking up a month?
About 20 students a month.
So you can see that adds over time. And then we also see a dip with our seniors at the end of the year. We do lose some of those seniors. Do you remember offhand about how many?
10 to 15 students probably.
Okay, perfect. So that's just kind of an average. I just want to point that out. So it could end up a little bit higher than that, just depending on how the year shakes out. But we have increased that 76 students from the preliminary budget. As the board probably recalls, we were even a little bit leery on that 12,684, but the district continues to outpace even the demographic studies we've had done by professionals. So positive thing from a revenue standpoint, it just creates challenges obviously with our capacity. Formula allowance, I kind of talked about that. That's roughly 60% of our budget, and 2% of that, we have 2% on the formula this year. So we're at the 7281, and so that was a $143 increase from last year. And then next year's increase that we were just looking at with that 2.74 is just under $200 a pupil unit, so that'll be positive for next year. Levy dollars, the levy accounts for about 30% of our revenue. And I know I've pointed this out a few times. This isn't like a standard across the state, so depending on where you're geographically located and the makeup of your district, the net tax capacity, all of that, this can shift pretty big. And so most districts don't have 30% levy revenue. It's closer probably to 10, 15, 20%. We have a very supportive community and we have good net tax capacity. And then the special ed cross subsidy, that's been really huge for us. With that legislative action that was taken in the spring of 2023, that really did cover a lot of costs for us. Our challenge right now, and we've talked about this at several board meetings, is that we are seeing our special ed costs rise pretty considerably. So the impact on the general fund will kind of wash out at some point, if that makes sense. So even though we are getting a lot more coverage with that 75% reimbursement, we're also seeing needs go up, which is also driving costs up. That is not unique to us. And something that I've mentioned, and I don't want to get too deep into it because it gets really complex, but we did find a mechanism where we could use $1.5 million of our federal special education funding and shift that over to pay tuition billing. It's a dollar for dollar pay down, and then we can shift those costs into state special education. So it allows the district to essentially generate about 75% more revenue than it would have in the past. So that was another option that our team worked with special ed department to come up with a way to help offset some of those additional costs. And then finally, the federal allocation. So we brought this before too, but the COVID dollars came to an end on 9/30 of this year. And so you've seen a big adjustment in our federal dollars. All right, key budget assumptions. I'm not going to go into this too big. This is just more of an information slide, but it just highlights what we talked about. Obviously for FY26, we now know what that is. So we know that it won't be the 2%, it'll be the 2.74. All right. David, I'm talking way too much. Did I just take your slide?
That's okay. I'm not going to argue.
We had a deal. So sorry, David. Director Johansson would say, even on Friday at our finance committee of the board, and Danny would say too that David and Jen both talked a lot more than me. So, and that was kind of the plan. It's not going to plan right now. So they're gonna have to stop me.
You're okay.
Okay, all right. So just key budget assumptions, something that I always like to point out, you're gonna see at the end of this presentation that the district's sitting at about 3.2 million projected revenue over expenditure. And we always go back to the fact that growing enrollment is basically the big subsidizer that allows districts to continue to expand, add programming, add a lot of things. It generates a lot of funding. And then depending on where that growth comes in, you can also kind of benefit it from an economies of scale standpoint. So if you look here and you just take the basic formula allowance of the 7281 that we just covered a few slides ago, and you multiply that by the increase of students over last year's revised budget, which is 352, that's $2.56 million. And then if you just use kind of a high level estimate when you factor in state aid and the levy and multiply that 352 by 10,000 now, you're seeing a $3.5 million. So the reason I point this out, you can probably come to the conclusion, but it's just to show our revenue over expenditures is driven by student enrollment and growth. So I point that out because when that changes or when that slows, and this team will make sure that we are all over that and we're guiding the board and the superintendent, but that will obviously change the way that we do business. So that's something that we are watching constantly, and as a district, we know we are very well aware of what happens when not only you slow, but you lose enrollment. So, which is the reason for all of these slides, just to kind of tell the full story. This is just an information slide. It's just a breakout. It's a visualization of where our revenues kind of sit from. All right, and then budget recap, same thing that we've already discussed. All right, David?
Thank you, Scott. So this one's for the FY24-25 expenditure projection information. We did the prelim budget based on what we expected the salaries were to end at. Now with those contracts being done, we are able to come with the revised and see what the actuals are going to be for the future. And so that's giving us a better projection of where they're going to sit, by the end of the fiscal year. Transfer stations, the budget increased by, during the prelim, 6%. There has been just a very minor adjustment for the revised budget, which we work with Rich Anga from CISO, and he's fantastic at his budgeting. So, and review it once he sends it back to us. Utilities, I had Jack Stearns do a 10-year projection on that last prelim, and we had to increase that with electric going up 4%, heat going up 2%, and water 6%, which was a fantastic thing we did. So we used 10 years of data and kind of saw where that projection was. And then Jack, this year for revised, had to increase it a bit more, just with everything coming in extra costs as we move forward with inflation. LTFM, the projected was 14 million expenditures. We have not adjusted this budget. It still stays the same since it's a 10-year plan that we revise every year with MDE. Special education, there's the prelim. There's been just the adjustments with the salaries and benefits with the actuals now. What's the contracted services? Our contracted staffing is done, so we know where that's going to sit, and with a 1.5 increase into state aid from the federal, which those dollars, like Scott said, the 1.5 reduces our tuition billing, and then thus we generate 75% more with having those costs in the state aid instead of on federal. Technology, that we work with Wade Phillips on that, and he does a fantastic job. His budget is all levy based, so we update that as the school year goes on, and so we sent him the budget and he revised it as we move forward, and it looks fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Just one thing to add on the special education. That's what I was talking about earlier. We're just seeing those costs kind of increase. So just full transparency to the board. We increased that budget about 4%. So just looking over since about FY21, I think our costs are up about $8 million. So it's just something that we're watching. But obviously we need to serve the needs of our students in the district too. It's just a big cost that I think a lot of people predicted would come out of the pandemic. There's just a visualization, just breaking down. I like this because it shows we are a people-oriented business, and so this is where the majority of our costs come in. So you can see here, roughly 71% of our costs are coming from salaries and benefits. This is just more of the same, just visualization. I think I said this at a last board meeting. I had a mentor once that told me to show graphs and visualization. So that's why they're on here. So he would be proud. Just to point out the pandemic and cost containment. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the pandemic impacted Wayzata really uniquely. And I think even for our legislators and local government, I don't think they truly understood the impact that Wayzata had. I think it's easy to say, well, Wayzata has tons of money. They have a big fund balance. They have a lot of this, which none were really true. So because we are a pupil-driven revenue system, we were hit pretty tremendously. So as all of you know, we were planning on growing by about 250 students. We did not see that come to fruition. We lost 200 students. So, and then the timing of the pandemic, we didn't really have necessarily time to react. And so we held on to a lot of staff. And as the board remembers, that July, it first started as a 2-week shutdown. And then in July, it was almost double up your staff because you're going to have to do in-person and hybrid. And so districts were left with making choices. And we made a choice to hold on to our staff. And so that cost us pretty dearly. And so we saw, losing those 200 kids, so a net of 450 roughly, and then seeing very little growth that next year. Obviously, that compounds pretty tremendously. So that's why we went into cost containment. And just to point out on this slide, there's a lot of information. We've covered something similar in the past, but when you look at the underfunding for decades, that's why I love that slide about 3 or 4 ago that showed the $17.4 million that we would have if our revenue kept up with inflation. And then as I pointed out, not all schools were impacted by the pandemic, or not all impacted the same by the pandemic. So if you were a district that kind of had flat growth or at a high free and reduced percentage, you probably did pretty well during the pandemic, to be honest, because you saw a lot of revenue come in. And now I don't know that that's the case because those cuts had to happen now with the dollars winding out. But the pandemic impacted everybody so uniquely, but we were all affected kind of the same. I won't go through this. I kind of touched on some of it, but just the decision, obviously we went off the best information we had at the time. During the pandemic, we stayed loyal to our students and staff to provide the staff to support those students during that pretty exceptional, crazy time. So, and then finally just government did step in with federal dollars, but I don't think it was necessarily proportionate because it was based primarily on kind of the title funding. But obviously we're all impacted pretty tremendously, so. All right. This one I think I've kind of touched on the top part. So moving forward with the financial fitness of the district and long-term sustainability. So this is something that we're constantly talking about, but we're looking at enrollment all the time. We're looking at what we're going to get in funding in the future, which now we know for next year, which is helpful because usually we aren't able to really predict that until we know. And then we also recognize that we know that our expenditures are going to outpace our revenues by a percentage. So as soon as that enrollment slows or stops, obviously we just need to be very, very well aware of it. And even as we're planning with our fund balances, just to keep that in mind. So. All right, I think I've covered a lot. I think, Chase, you're probably right. I can probably cut some slides out in the future. So, but this just kind of highlights, I think this is just good information to have. And like I said, a lot of these slides, I put them in here because this goes out on the district website and it's something that the public can reference back to along with our community. All right, this just kind of highlights, this shows what I talked about a little bit earlier. This is a little bit different, and it might be a little bit tricky to understand because I'm grabbing 10-1 counts, which is the official count on October 1st. And so it doesn't necessarily align with some of the counts we've talked about, but I like it just because it's official. You could use different dates throughout the year, end of year, but I like this just because it's official. So you can see prior to the pandemic, the district had seen some pretty big growth years and steady growth as an aggregated average. You see the drop there, and now you see that we're growing pretty tremendously again. This would be the impact. So outside of that $17 million that we would have if our general revenue had kept up with inflation, this just shows what one could come to assume based on the pandemic, the dollars that the district went without. So on top of the revenue not keeping up with inflation, when you look at where we would have ended with enrollment, which is kind of that yellowish line, it shows 13,011 for the last fiscal year that just closed. If you just did simple math and applied that, the district at a minimum would have missed out on about 11.4 million and at a maximum of about 22 million. So pretty significant impacts for the district during the pandemic. And this is just more graphic. It just shows where the green is where we thought we would be and the blue is where we ended up. This just shows, and we've talked about this several times, but the district made the tough decision, and I don't take credit for it. I give credit to my predecessor and the other executives and leaders in the district, along with Superintendent Anderson and the board, making the tough decisions. But when we went into cost containment, it was very wise. And I think as we pick up the newspapers and watch the news on TV, I think it just highlights what a wise decision that was. I'm sure, I mean, I know it was wildly unpopular, but it has showed that it was the right thing to do. The other challenge could be you could look and say, wow, the district, the goal was to cut about $11 million over that 3-year time frame, and now you're projecting a $3.2 million revenue over expense. Like, what were you guys thinking? How were you so off? I would say we absolutely had to do this, and the unknown variable is the massive student growth that we're seeing, which is why we had the fall we did with the demographic and enrollment studies. So this all came into play. This was absolutely crucial because it kind of right-sized things after the pandemic. And if we wouldn't have seen that student growth, or we would have seen slightly below estimated student enrollment growth, this would be pretty crucial. And if we hadn't done this, we'd be in a different story right now. We would be breaking even, or we would still be cutting. So it's just important to remember that, because I always point to that student growth, but it can make it look like, geez, did we really need to do those cuts? And I've been asked that several times, and I say, absolutely, we had to do those cuts. So, all right, David, do you want to talk about the LTFM adjustment?
Yeah, so Wayzata School District is a 1A district, so it allows us to levy for the dollar amount that we need to maintain our school district. So LTFM is long-term facility maintenance. We do a 10-year plan with MDE, and every year we do update that. And so this would allows us to work on our schools and update them to get them to working capacity for things that are like for like. So replacing anything that's similar, but nothing beyond. It does allow for some pieces. You can go more energy efficient lights, and that's one thing that LTFM will cover, just with the changes in efficiency and everything like that. That's one thing it will cover. We usually levy around $7.5 to $16.5 million every year. So this year you'll see an adjustment of $5.4 million, and this is from a prior 2 fiscal years ago. So how the levy works, what you see for your adjustments are 2 fiscal years behind. So we're seeing like an adjustment of 5.4 million. And the reason is this, because it was in 21-22 when supply chains were having an issue, and we also couldn't get contracted services just because there was a lack of people working in the market, and also the supplies were not readily available. So that is one thing we are seeing this adjustment come through. It doesn't affect our fund balance at all, because it is a restricted fund balance, so it sits in its own restricted fund. It's just MDE taking those funds back, so it's no negative effect to the district. We just couldn't get to those projects on time due to supply chain issues.
Perfect. Thanks, you, Dave. Thank you, David. And those will continue to flow. We'll have a big adjustment coming this next year, and then we're hoping that will start to flatten out. So I know Director John Deutsch talked about it last time, but our partners at Wold had mentioned if we wanted to truly keep up with everything in the district, and that assumes we'd be able to find contractors and be able to get the work done. But we'd have to spend about $21 million a year on LTFM just to keep our buildings in a good spot. But we are very grateful to be a 1A district, which is a really important thing for us because we're able to keep up on our buildings. And one could say, you know, if we didn't have these funds, the buildings would fall into disrepair much earlier, and the expense to build or redo or tear down and build a new school would be far, far more than these funds. So it allows us to be responsible with the local taxpayer dollars. All right, Jen. Just to kind of talk about this, and then I'll turn it over to Jen. As the board knows, we're winding down on our COVID funding. I'm not going to lie, I think all of us that are responsible for the reporting are glad. I think Jen's got one more big session to close out all the grants. But Jen, I don't know if you want to kind of talk about the COVID funding.
Sure. Go through the bullet points quickly. In the beginning, all in, since fiscal 21, we've, as a district, received $11.8 million. Much of that funding was targeted to specific areas, a lot of parameters around how we could spend it and when we could spend it. The remaining funds that we carried over into this fiscal year expired on September 30th of 2024. We have drawn all of those funds, so we have received everything. And as Scott mentioned, there's just one more final survey to be completed to say how we spent it, and then that wraps that up.
Perfect. Thanks, Jen. And I think one of the things I highlighted earlier, I talked about just the impacts to districts differently, because when you really look at that $11.8 million, it's absolutely a lot of money. But when you're factoring in roughly on average a $200 million expenditure budget each year, so over that 4-year time frame, it's $11.8 million on $800 million worth of budget. It really didn't do a whole lot. So at the time, that wasn't a very good thing. Obviously, we went into cost containment, but in the end, it was probably we should be kind of grateful we didn't get a lot, because a lot of districts across the state fell in love with a lot of those positions they added, and the funding obviously didn't continue, so you're seeing lots of cuts throughout the state. So I think we are very wise with that. We were able to supplant some of it early on, but a lot of those were one-time funds or positions that we've worked with teaching and learning and other departments to kind of wind down, if you will, and we've had a plan for a year or two of how we would cover those, or if we could cover them in the interim until additional funding came in. All right, cross-subsidy aid, we kind of talked about this, but I just have this on here again. This will go on the webpage. It's just good information for the board and the public to have, but just pointing out the cross-subsidy aid was a pretty huge thing. So in FY23, and that came about now covering about 75% of our expenditures, and then with us being able to use $1.5 million of federal to generate even more state special education funding, it's been a big help for us as we've seen our demand increase for that, which has driven our costs. All right, now to the good stuff. So that was a lot of talking. We'll start out right away. So this is kind of the part where it gets a little bit confusing because we have LTFM included, and then our next slide here will be excluding LTFM. And that's what you saw in your board packets as well. This is similar to what you saw in the preliminary budget back in June, but we like to show both. So as David talked about with LTFM, with that adjustment, it does not really impact our finances. On its face, it does because it's in our financial report. It's a restricted account, but it kind of ebbs and flows with the levy. So honestly, it's more of a cash flow issue than it is a financial issue. So what I mean by that is because we levied that, we intended to do those, we received the funds through the levy. So if anything, it helps for cash flow for a while. And then they obviously take those dollars back after the 2-year lag. So David, I wonder if you want to run through kind of the differences?
Yeah. So the first one is local property taxes. That's our levy. We increased that from prelim budget about $600,000, And that's due to last year, we're seeing quite a bit of delinquencies on our taxes collected. So those are individuals not paying their taxes, businesses and homes. And so that was an uptick. So we were conservative and said we'd do a little bit of offlift. And so those tax payments, we get them in May and June, in October and November, and we also get a final one in January. So we've collected all the ones for this fiscal year, and I'm not seeing those delinquencies like we did last year. So we are able to add that back in. So that's a nice little chunk of change back to Wayzata Public Schools without having to see those delinquencies. State aids are up 1.6 million, almost 1.7 million. That's due to our student count increase. And so that's nice to see as that moves forward. The federal aid is up 1.3, and that's due to mostly all the carry forward funds. So every year, the funds that we don't use, we can carry those over for the next 2 fiscal years and also until 3 more months until September. And so that uptick is from that. So we are budgeted those funds, and we are going to utilize them either this year. So we budget them, and then we'll make sure that we carry forward those funds next year if we do not utilize them.
And I think I would just add on the federal aid, as the board recalls on the prelim, I mentioned this was being put together in March, April, and May of last year. And so at that point, we were estimating what we thought we might get to go through for federal, try to spend down those funds. And so obviously, once the fiscal year ends, when we do this revised, that uptick and increase in federal is due to the carryover that we weren't able to spend that we likely spent right away in July or August or September.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. The next one for revenues is other local revenues. This is most of the miscellaneous donations and also interest earned revenues, and that's increased by 196,000. This is mostly due to Wade Phillips area. He gets E-rate funds back, so any supplies that he purchases, some of them are able to get a rebate on it, and so we budgeted that 196,000 for this year, and we've been working with Wade more thoroughly and making sure these budgets are budgeted, and also making sure that he'll spend them in the future. And so that's been an increase on that. On to expenditures. Salary and benefits are down 1.9 million. The reduction is when we built the preliminary budget, we budget conservatively. We had 26 FTE that we still needed to hire. And so we budget at those employees taking family benefits and also taking the match on their 403Bs, which is 4% of their salary. And so we're actually seeing a lot of people taking singles, and it might just be due to the district's benefits costing a bit more in premiums. So that's been a reduction in that, and that was about 1.4. And the also reduction of 400,000 is we're not seeing yet the unemployment costs increasing for the summer unemployment. It has increased over prior fiscal year, but I just don't think we believe that not everyone knows about it or has claimed it. So I would say those costs will probably likely increase in the future. And also we won't be funded based on, 170. They set up down, I can't remember how much the pot of money was, but I know it is dwindling.
Yeah, I think I would just add to Director Draskowicz what he was talking about with the health too, obviously accounting for those new hires. And we also saw just across the district, we saw our health benefits kind of decrease from what people were taking. So if people were taking family before, they jumped down. So it was kind of across the board. So we saw big savings there too. And as David said, with the TSAs, with the 403Bs, we have to assume people are going to contribute enough to get the match. And we also saw kind of a decrease in that as well. So that makes a pretty big impact. And then the summer employment, just to point out, on our audit report, those are dollars that we set aside. So I can't remember right offhand. I want to say it's like 1.3 million. It's a mixture of summer unemployment for the future and the another funding stream. I'm mind blanking right now, but Yes, we have set that aside, as the board recalls, because that pot of money is going away with the state. I think it'll be gone this year. And so the district is set up to handle a few years of those adjustments. So, sorry, David.
No, thank you. The next one on expenditures is purchase services. That's right now an increase of $2 million. Quite a chunk of that is from buildings and grounds and operations. They were under budgeted in fiscal years, so we did increase their budget this year, and also a little bit with inflation due to the utilities. They don't have an option. They have to repair our buildings. If it's not under LTFM, like for like, they have to go in and fix things. So and we have to make sure our buildings are up to par, for our students. So we definitely increased that budget just so we could go with actuals and say this is what it's going to look like by the fiscal year end. Supplies and materials that increased by 1.9. Some of this is due to new funding sources when we were waiting for the READ Act and also the Literacy Act. Also John's area for his supplies and materials that go for buildings and grounds and repairs, and also just a little bit smidge of seeing extra costs in our inflation. I do run the cash flow module and make sure that we're running cash, and I can see that our supplies are well over what they have been in the past fiscal years. Operating capital is at 1.3 million. This is an increase from prelim, and this is mostly due to our technology that we need to make some purchases for a lot of our school cameras. They're coming to end of life, and Scott has been working due diligently with Wade on that. And also, it's for the purchase of furniture. So with our growing enrollment and how fast it's coming in, we've utilized everything at the warehouse, and so we have no furniture left over. So around this March timeframe, me and Jack Stearns are working together to make sure that we're getting our kits of parts for the elementaries and also making sure the middle schools are whole for next fiscal year, because we will end up doing a middle school refresh in the near future, maybe with the bond referendum. And also, so our plan is to make sure we have a kit of parts for that. And so it makes it easier for ordering. So that was a big chunk of budgeting that. I think Jack was telling me it's around $700,000 of furniture moving forward with that.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And so when you look at that, this is the one that if you looked and you went, oh my gosh, we're in big trouble. When you look over on the bottom right, you'd see a negative 2.3 million. That is with the LTFM included. So obviously, like I said, that is more of a cash flow issue than anything, but technically we show it on this slide. To the left, I didn't go through a lot of this because we've gone through this before, but just so the board knows, that's just information kind of on the funding, the general fund, and then with our unassigned fund balance that we've talked about several times, just talks about, why we keep that and then some of the things that could happen that would be helpful for us to have it. So this is the slide that really is kind of how we're doing business, right? Like how everything's looking, how we're projecting that we think we'll end up. And so you can see there on the preliminary budget, when we came to the board in June, we were projecting we'd be about 2.7 million revenue over expenditures, which is a big positive change coming out of cost containment, this year being our last year of cost containment. But obviously we all know we are up kids. So we are up students pretty tremendously. And next year we're forecasting another big growth year, to a point where David and I feel very uncomfortable, and we question Jen all the time, even though I went over it with her and a whole bunch of people did, and Dana did, and but we're just seeing pretty incredible growth. So what does that mean? We're a people-driven revenue system, and so we're seeing that revenue increase, which then is obviously impacting the bottom line. That doesn't go without costs. That one thing that I guess I'll point on, the salary and benefits, we did see the decline there. We have added quite a bit of staff with the student enrollment. And so those costs are still grabbed inside of there. But you can see here, we're projecting we'll end up at about 3.2 million revenue over expenditures. When you look at that on the bottom line, it doesn't tell the full story, because some of that won't all be to the unassigned fund. It could vary anywhere from probably 2.3 million to 2.7 million will hit the unassigned fund. So that will probably take us up. I think David and I looked at that a little bit before, because we figured the question, whoops, yikes, I went way back. That wouldn't be a show of mine without something going wrong. So, all right, perfect. So just looking at that, so if we did roughly, let's say of this 3.2 million, if 2.7 went to the unassigned and the remainder went into restricted or assigned accounts, that would obviously be added to the unassigned fund balance, which last year ended at 16.9 million, and we ended the year at about 8.32% unassigned fund balance. If we added 2.7 million to the unassigned fund, that would put us at about 9.4%. Just historically, over the last 12 years, we've averaged about an 8.82% unassigned fund balance, just to give perspective to the board. The parameters are that 5 to 7%. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to control, and we're seeing the growth that we are, and then the ebbs and flows that we have. So We're hoping we're kind of in normal times for at least where we can predict a little bit, but I figured that question would probably be coming, so that's something David and I have been looking at. I will say, and Dr. Anderson can chime in, but I know as an executive team and leadership team, we've been talking about next year and some of the things that we can kind of add back. I don't know, Dr. Anderson, if you want to talk about any of that.
Well, one of the things that I would share is just a focus and a priority that I've spoken about at PTA meetings and in work sessions is the focus on class size and classroom teachers and prioritizing not only that aspect and trying to regain some ground that we lost during the reductions that we made, and then also in our student support service area in regard to student support teams, not necessarily additional in special education or EL, even though there have been some increases there as well. But when we think in terms of counseling services and providing that support to students, not only at the elementary level, but hopefully at the middle school level as well, as we continue to take a look at staffing ratios and trying to reinforce and support all of the needs of students, even beyond just their academic needs. And you might recall also that the state has been increasing funding specifically targeted for counselors and similarly functioned, if that's the right way to say it, student support service staff that can be utilized. And I think the increases that the state doled out a couple of years ago are in year 3 with the upcoming 25-26 school year. So I think then that'll be at least that established cap at the time of those increased resources. So not only are we seeing an increased need for students to be served through our special education programming and EL programming, but just students' needs in general have continued to increase, and the elementary counselors that we've added in the last several years have been very well received and have been very helpful within the buildings, working directly with the teachers, principals, and other members of the student support team. So as we continue to work our way forward in our staffing design and model for next year, that has remained the priority and focus area for myself and our leadership team members as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. This next slide, it's the same information on the left. On the right, I know that's really easy to see. Should have made that bigger, couldn't. But when you look at it, I think just kind of closing statement, obviously we know we're not asking for board approval tonight, but obviously we are seeing things kind of turn around. I don't think it's by accident. I think the board and the district leadership were wise to go into cost containment when we did. And then we've just been very lucky that we live in the geographic location that we do in the state of Minnesota, because we are seeing growth. We're forecasting continued growth. Even next year we look, it's like I don't even want to say the numbers because obviously we saw them during the demographic study, but we're looking at a potential year of north of 400 kid growth again like we did this year. Spread kind of across all 3 areas. I think when I was questioning Jen again today, she pulled all the data out like she has like 12 times for me, and we went over it again, but you guys pay me to be paranoid. So when we look at that, I think, Jen, what did you say, even from what we projected next year, even at the middle school level, from what we projected to what we have enrolled right now, I wonder if you talk about some of those numbers, not to put you on the spot. But I
Without
just did.
anything in front of me.
Okay.
Yes, what we projected with the demographic study that we did this fall, and who is currently in our system as if school were to start today, I think we're short 60 students at the middle school level from what our projections are right now, and it's only March. So thinking about the time that we have there, and at the high school level, I want to say it's like 25 students. So elementary is a little harder to gauge right now because kindergartners need to get enrolled and get through that. But yeah, it's a lot of growth again this year.
Yeah, so we're watching that very closely. So again, just kind of in closing, obviously things were coming out of the last year of our cost containment, hopefully. But I say that just kind of with the asterisk that we need to recognize, and I'm always the one in the room because it's my job to just remind of the things that could change it quickly. And so we also know there's a lot of uncertainty around federal funding right now, something we need to keep in mind. If the student growth would slow, or if, we're projecting north of 400 kid growth next year, and let's say it comes in at 200, we're trying to be really methodical, even with our add backs as a leadership team, with what we're looking at, because we don't want to kind of return to the situation that we had in the past. And then obviously we have negotiations, continual negotiations with our staffing and different bargaining units. And then the special education cost increases. This is something, even with the cross subsidy, we're watching very closely. One of the really kind of things that we have to be aware of as a finance team is maintenance of effort, because as those dollars go up, we're now stuck with those dollars. So you can look and go, wow, we're getting 75% reimbursement. So impact still, is coming close to what it used to impact us before because the costs are growing, but we're now going to be kind of saddled with that $26 million amount. So, and for board members, we have to spend at least, is it a penny or a dollar more than a penny more than we did the prior year? So it can put a lot of constraint on the district in the future. So we're just being really watchful about that. And then obviously we are always looking at referendums. So that will be something that will be coming up to the board in the next year or less with the operating referendum. We've got the tech levy, just a lot of variables. So, and then as I said, short-term facility needs, that's something that we're addressing right now that the board is aware of at West Middle School. So with this big student growth, the district had to be very creative too. So luckily, Principal Carlson at West Middle School is a fantastic guy, along with the other two middle school principals, and they worked really well together on this. But as the board knows, we'll be doing a project over there to convert over 13,000 square feet of locker room space into usable classroom space to be able to handle the need. Principal Carlson's building will increase pretty tremendously over the next 2 years. So with a cap of hopefully 1,000 kids, but I think he's sitting at about 840 right now. We're projecting him to be at 966 next year. And obviously, we're hoping that that locker room and redo of some areas can be really resourceful with the properties that the district already has to really be wise with those dollars and spend them efficiently. So trying to think of anything else. Obviously, we're watching things just keeping pace with inflation, and then we're just kind of taking a picture of the whole thing, watching it all the time. And we all know that and student enrollment growth is kind of the key to our success of pulling out of this. So, all right. And I just talked about all of those things, and I'm still waiting for the day that they say, you know what, we're going to catch up to inflation, and then it's going to be retroactive, and then we'll be having a whole nother conversation. But I'm not going to hold my breath. Any questions from the board?
Thank you, Scott, David, and Jen. So Jen, if once you finish the CARES Act report, the last report, you will have more time to focus on enrollment every day, right?
That's right, every day.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you again, board colleagues. Any questions or comments on the presentation? Valentina? Oh, okay. Dan, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for putting this presentation together. It really means a lot. I'm grateful for the little check-in we were able to have last week. Just really touch base on the numbers as we see them. My one question, I believe, Jen, you touched on it briefly, to kind of go back to our registration numbers again, but what is our kindergarten numbers? We're in kindergarten enrollment right now. So just kind of talk, it's still early, but just kind of what we're seeing with our kindergarten registration so far.
We're on pace to where we have been prior years at the same time frame. I was actually just talking to Dr. Anderson today about that we get a little bit of a lull right now, and then it'll start to pick up again. It's like families want to get through spring break here, and then they start thinking about their plans for next school year. So we'll see an uptick in that. It's not anything, we're not down from total percentages of what we're expecting from the last 2 years at least that I have data for.
All right, thank you.
I will have several questions. I already asked several of them via email. Can I reiterate back what I heard? So you are planning to have bond referendum, then operating a referendum and tech levy. Am I right?
Yes, not all at the same time, but yes, over the
Yeah.
next several years.
It means that we will be asking from taxpayers more money.
Yes, yep, that's correct. But over the next several years. So obviously, due to the needs of the growing district, that's where a building bond referendum would potentially come to the public. And that would be based purely on the need of the student growth that we're experiencing. And then, like I talked about at the West Middle School, we're trying to maximize all of our facilities that we can, which is also the reason why we did a demographic study. Getting to the operating referendum, that's something that comes up every 10 years, I believe. And so it will be coming up as soon, I think our first time we can renew it would be July 1, 2025. So coming up here. And then I believe we have a 24-month or 36-month window to do that. And then the tech levy, we have 2 of those running. And so I think the next one, don't quote me, but I want to say that's 27, 28. I don't have that in front of me. I apologize. But yes, those would be things. And those are things that necessarily, with the operating referendum, those are things that the public is already experiencing currently, and that would be the same with the tech levy as well. So obviously, when we look at a building bond referendum, that would have an impact, but that would be based primarily driven by student growth. I think during the enrollment study that we did, we even had people from the public. We got a lot of comments that said, why have you not started on a new building? Why do you not have an elementary school built? Why do you not have a middle school built? As we just covered here, we saw really ebbs and flows in enrollment over the last several years. And so I think the district was planning, I think the district and the board were planning back in 2019 for this growth, potential new schools, pandemic hit, and change kind of the whole dynamic. So it would have been pretty weird for us to go to the public during a time that we were seeing declining enrollment growth to ask for new schools. So now it's just coming to us really fast, obviously, as we're seeing this above average and above projected growth.
Couple of things that I might just add to that too. So all of these things will come back to before the board for a lot of conversation and discussion. So we have, Scott mentioned we have 2 technology levies. One of those was just renewed last fall, I believe, for a 10-year period. And then there's a second one that will come up in a few years. So we have those 2 that provide the technology resources. And I just wanted to point out too that the legislature took action a couple years ago about renewal of general operating levies, where it used to be every 10 years approximately you would need to go to the voters to have those approved. They created or implemented a new law a couple years ago in the legislative session that school boards may renew their current operating levy at the same amount for a 10-year period without bringing it back to the voters. And you can do that one time with general operating levy. So those will be discussions that we'll be having in the coming months or year, just in regard to what the school board may want to be thinking about in that regard for the future. So those are the key things to keep in mind, but I just wanted to reinforce that we'll be having much more discussion before those would come to the board for a vote, and for sure with the possible capital bond referendum for facilities, and possibly up to and including building 1 or 2 new schools, but none of that has been decided yet, and we're in the process of needs assessment currently. Thank you.
I have some more questions, if it's okay. Another question is about COVID. I'm surprised to hear about that some schools open new positions. I think that a year ago we had an article saying about Robbinsdale that it was specifically told that schools are not supposed to use that money to open new positions, because once you open the positions, there is no money coming. And of course, we had to find funds somehow. That's how my understanding, Robbinsdale ended up in the situation where we have to cut a lot of, where we have to face budget cuts too, big number. Another one I was going to ask, with REDACT, I asked via email, but probably it's worth asking in public, that about money. Did you also put into consideration how much money we already get, and are we going to get paid by the state full amount so that it's not coming from general fund?
Yes, I can have Director Draskowicz talk about that, but absolutely, and I think I'll just add before David talks, those are restricted funds. So when they come to us from the state, which some have, those have to sit there in restricted funds. So
Yeah, so we've already been paid on the REDACT funds. It was about $543,000, and most of our training has occurred, if I remember correctly, with because we paid about $274,000 in training.
Yeah, so those teachers that were in the first wave of training, most of those have already been paid. The only ones who are not complete yet are our early learning teachers who qualify under that, and they'll be done this spring. But then we also have a second wave of that phase one starting. A lot of our special ed teachers will start this spring and summer, and then that money gets held in that restricted fund for that. And then our secondary teachers will undergo training, but the state has not released what training that is they want them going through yet. And so that has been delayed by a year. And again, we have those funds for that, but it's in that restricted fund.
Thank you, Dana. Sorry to throw you on it. Yeah. So yes, we have been paid on those funds. We are paying them out, but they, like Dana Miller said, they are a restricted fund balance, so they will sit there until we utilize all of them.
That's nice to know, because I heard in the past that sometimes state put mandates, but money doesn't come, and then you have to find money. How you're going to be covering the cost and all. That was also the concern. Thank you.
thanks.
I just have a comment. I want to say thank you for bringing us this good news. This is a good news report. We have weathered our cost containment years, which makes me feel really good, because it was really hard. It was hard to make those decisions. It was hard to, try to project where we would be, and those cuts were really, really deep and hard. So thank you also to my colleagues who were also in the past, and other administrators for having made those decisions alongside us. Our Wayzata family is growing, and that's good news. And so with that, there's going to be some squeeziness along the way, and we're all just going to saddle up for it as we're entering into this, but it is good news because it means that we can offer our students more things, and I thank you for bringing that forth. Also, our annual state increase sounds much better than 2%. 2.74 is great. So again, thanks for the good news report, and thanks for putting this all together for us.
Couple more questions, sorry. I'll try to make it quick. Knowing that we will be negotiating with teacher union and unaffiliated group this summer, at the same time facing financial challenges like SPED on the rise, ELL on the rise, inflation, purchase services, supply materials on the rise, how are we as a board going to get realistic picture of what we can afford, so that we are not sending our district back to another cycle of budget cuts in the nearest future, and even bigger class sizes, which is not going to be sustainable?
Perfect. That's a great question. Currently, the finance team, this is something we've talked about several times. We're in the middle of working on our 3-year projection out. So as I mentioned during the budget presentation, we're in a unique situation where we do have student growth. So a lot of districts will do the 5-year. We do a 5-year. We even look out a little bit more than that. But really, after 3 years, it kind of gets really fuzzy and not really reliable. So we pay attention to the 3-year. And so what we'll do for the board is basically put that together. It will project out where we think student growth will be. It'll project out, it'll have several assumptions on different growth areas and expenditures outside of salary and benefits. It will go off of aggregated average salary increases that we know about, and then we'll use estimates on other areas, and we'll be able to show you kind of a picture of where we think we'll be in 3 years, and then that will help make that decision. So the board will be able to know kind of parameters and what impacts that will have with the district. So I guess I would just add, without student growth, I think it would be a different story. So if we were flatline student growth, we'd be having a completely different discussion. We're now having a discussion where we're going to have facility crunches. And as Director Cater said, we're all just going to, kind of be cozy and maximize our buildings to be really resourceful to our local taxpayers and make sure we're maximizing our square footage.
And I am glad to hear, to be honest, that this hopefully will allow us to make sure that our class sizes are smaller and our kids are getting additional help like peers, because this, especially in elementary kids, students need it. And I'm hearing from my own child teacher that it's second year when she, in her 29th year experience, that she got such a big class. And she is obviously wanting that board will do something about it, because knowing that there are behavioral issues on top and loading into teachers' big class sizes is not sustainable. And I'm very pleased to hear that our students will get help. Our teachers, elementary especially teachers, will get help, and class sizes will get smaller. I'm very pleased to hear that news, to be honest. Thank you.
Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
I just want to reiterate, it's so great to have good news on this, and that we will be able to look at class sizes again. Do you know where the growth is coming from? I know we kind of know it's new construction, right? Or what are you seeing? Where are we getting all these students?
I like how we both looked at Jen, but
I haven't analyzed that data a lot yet for next school year. I was actually just telling the same leadership group earlier today that I am building new addresses in our system multiple times in a week, like anywhere from 5 to 10 a week. So that's the new growth. A lot of it up in that northwest corner still. As we get closer to the school year, I'll do a little bit more analysis as to where these kids are coming from. Are they coming back from non-public? Are they coming new from out of the state? But I haven't really taken time to look at that yet.
I think one thing to point out too is that I think we'll see redevelopment in parts of the district that are kind of changing over. So when we think of the east side of the district, even the southeast side, I think we're seeing some of that change already. I know when I go visit the buildings, there's a brand new construction house or two. So I think that will be something we'll also be looking at. But primarily, as we learned from the demographic study, that growth up in the northwest is pretty tremendous.
And as a district, we tend to attract families with children. I think the Wayzata School District is a draw for people, so we might be different than a lot of other areas in that way, which is good. I guess that this is mostly comments already. My question, so Valentina asked about the operating levy and the tech levy. Those are levies taxpayers are currently paying, and it would be a renewal of those. It wouldn't, I mean, to build new buildings, it would be an increase, but the operating and tech levies would just be a continuation of what people already experience. Is that?
Yes, and there could be some variability depending on the net tax capacity and how the district is changing. But yes, as generally, that's a correct statement.
And one last thing, Jen, you mentioned 60 students at the middle school level. I was having a hard time understanding what was that, how much space we have left, enough for 60 students?
No, that 60 students is just where we are from our projections. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but let's just say we projected 3,000 students. We already have 60 less than that enrolled in the district. So that just was trying to point out how close we are to the projections that we did with the demographic study already, knowing that it's March and we'll have students enrolling all the way through the first part of September before school starts.
I am getting a little antsy about building a fourth middle school, but thank you.
All right, thank you. While I make a comment, Amy, can you bring up the slide which shows those 4 houses on the left and 8 houses on the right, the next net tax capacity slide? So I just want to make a quick comment and echo Valentina and Sheila about, and Heidi, I think, about Dr. Anderson's mention of class sizes focus. I think that will probably be something that the community has been waiting to hear. So I think that's a nice thing to hear. So thank you, Dr. Anderson. On this slide here, it is my understanding that we as taxpayers, property taxpayers, we pay a certain percent of our home value. Is that right? So is that $800 a fixed amount every year that we collect from the levy, or does it vary every year? And as the values go up, should it not go up?
Yes, it should, but it's still spread. So school districts, we have a capped amount. So the state determines that, and we have a capped amount that we can receive. So we don't set home values. We don't determine, like when you get your property tax statement, we aren't the only ones on there. So this would be like in a perfect scenario, like if nothing changed and more. So the scenario would be if your house was worth $100,000, just using easy round numbers, and it stayed that amount, and then the district is seeing this continued growth. In theory, you would be paying less every year. So that $100 you're paying, you'd be paying $90, or you'd be paying $80 as the district expands and new houses are built. But what we know is reality is different than that. So that house that was $100,000 is now worth $200,000. And so that percentage is being applied to it. So you might see it going up, but that's because of the market assessed value of our home, which is outside of the district
So just
control.
High level, I'm looking at this. On the left, those houses are paying $200 initially. Then the new houses come up, and everybody's levy goes down to $100. What if we had everybody pay $150, which means that the ones on the left are still paying less, but we're collecting more, right? We would collect $1,200.
Yeah, I think they're two different examples. So the one is like the 800 that you're talking about on the left, and then it would be like the district's growing and there's more houses added. And so it's the same thing except showing more houses. So those people aren't still paying 800, now they're paying 100. And that was that scenario, like I said, of their house value.
Yeah, but okay. All right. The federal education fund, and you transfer 1.5 million. I think I asked you this in the email. I apologize. I read it at the last minute just while leaving home today. So I was not able to completely get the gist of it. But my question still remains. So we have taken 1.5 million from the federal funds and transferred it to the tuition for special education. So the federal funds that were supposed to be allocated for something specific, now that something has lost 1.5 million, right?
Actually, it's a great question. As I mentioned, it is super complicated, so that's why it's interesting to get into it. But it's actually the reverse of that. It would help us gain more because we had a place to put it. So tuition billing, usually that would cost us 1.4 times now, 1.25 more. We're able to pay that dollar for dollar. So when we get tuition billed by different districts or co-ops or intermediates, that can vary year to year, and it takes like over a year and a half to a lag for it to true up. But we're able to take federal dollars and pay dollar for dollar down on that. And then we take those costs that were being paid by that 1.5 million and we code them over to state special education. And so by doing that, we're covering dollar for dollar. And now we're covering those costs in state special ed. So we're gaining an additional 75% of revenue that we would have never had before.
So let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. So that $1.5 million that was allocated for something other than special education is not lost, right? I mean, we are not losing the value for the other program.
No, we're actually gaining value.
Okay.
So the risk, full disclosure, the risk side of that, which our team and our leadership team is well aware of when we made the decision to do that, is what happens when you shift it from federal to state. It increases your maintenance of effort. So we took a calculated approach on that, knowing it would be harder to peel that back. Because there's very few exceptions to being able to pull that maintenance of effort back. But we felt pretty confident that our special education costs were going to continue to increase when we made that decision. So we felt very confident that we wouldn't be, the risk analysis for the district, we felt pretty good about it. So absolutely nothing was gained. If anything, 75% additional revenue was gained. So
I'd like to add one more, just listening to you talk about it. The federal funds were for already special education aid.
Okay.
So I think I caught that when you were talking about it. So it was already federal special education dollars. And so we're not losing any special education, or another program's not losing any money, because it's all of it's meant for special education.
So like for like.
Yes.
Good. Okay. That was my main question. Okay. Thank you. So delinquencies is what you mentioned. There were delinquencies in property tax payments last year. I mean, how serious can it get? What can we do if the delinquencies, for some reason, keep going up and up and up, and we have 30% of our revenues from that side, right? That bucket.
Yeah, David can hop in too, but the state requires us to levy 105%, so that shields us from some of that as well. And we are in a district that has a high propensity to pay, so we don't really necessarily have to worry about that, I think, and David can talk to it more, but some of those lags might have been related to, or delinquencies might have been related to the pandemic and some of the fallout from that. So I would say as a whole, our district is, we typically don't see an issue with that.
There is no protection for us from that, right?
Well, it's 105%. So because we have to levy 105%, we gain a fund balance on that, and it protects us a little bit. But yeah, I mean, if everybody went out of business or quit paying, yeah, we'd have a problem.
Right.
So,
Okay. That's why we have a fund balance.
yeah, exactly.
And that's why we watch it so closely.
Yeah.
You know, every fiscal year we're looking at what the delinquencies look like, just to see if they're growing or declining.
Okay. You mentioned unemployment benefits. You haven't seen a lot of growth in that, possibly because the employees are not aware of the benefits. Maybe that's one reason, I agree. But there is also another couple of reasons where unemployment benefits are not given randomly, or, it's not a given that unemployment benefit applications will all be approved. The employees have to look for a job. They cannot sit at home and claim unemployment benefits. They can also not refuse jobs that are pertinent. So those are probably the things that are basically preventing us or them from claiming unemployment benefits, and therefore we are not seeing probably that growth. Would that be a fair statement?
Possibly. I think we're a little bit unique too in our district because the money will be gone this year statewide. That don't quote me, 150 million roughly that was set aside. I think the burn rate, Dr. Anderson, on your AMSD call, that money's going to be gone this year. So we've experienced less, I think last year, what did we spend, David? 296?
If I remember, it was 296, and this year already after summer unemployment, it's 450,000.
Yeah, so we are seeing an increase and an uptick, but I think just based on our demographic area, we aren't seeing the utilization of that, but I'm only saying that towards our district. I think statewide, the proof is that it is being utilized because those funds are being burned through. So I think we might be a unique outlier in that. I don't know if that's fair to say. To be honest, I haven't spent a ton of time studying it. I just wanted to get it right for Wayzata.
Okay. And then one last question. Amy, can you bring up the chart where it shows the projected growth, and then you have that exponential curve going up? I think you have it only up to 23, 24. The dashed line and then another green line underneath, that's exponential.
The growth line?
Yeah. Keep going. Not that one, no. That one right there. So this is 23, 24. So where do you think we are in terms of the gap with the enrollment increase? Are we closer to that green line? We should be, right?
Yeah, we're closing the gap. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yep. So we're above average growth from even what projection would be. So, we were just talking about it today, going through the TeamWorks demographic study, and then you guys pay us to be paranoid. So we run 2 internal models and one with kind of an outside agency too, to just check numbers, just because we like check and balance, and then a check and balance on those numbers. So we are seeing that increase tremendously. When you look at the demographic study that Hazel Reinhardt did in the fall of 2022, when I started, we're Jen, 2.5 years above forecast on Hazel's. So we are absolutely closing that gap. So it was wide, and as you can see there, it's closing, and that 12,499, what we ended up on, you saw Jen's report today, likely a lot of you did. We're north of 12,800 and projecting to be roughly around, north of 13,200, 300 next year. So
it's very likely and possible that that line will intersect and go above above the straight lines in the next year or two?
Yeah, it's so hard to say.
I know.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, you're asking conservative accountants, so.
Yeah, that's all the questions I have, unless somebody else has a comment question that just came up. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, David, and thank you, Jen. We appreciate your effort. I don't know if you just keep seeing numbers in your dream all every night, or
I have to say, though, I know I'm the one that does a lot of the talking.
Yeah.
I have a fantastic team, which, my committee chairs recognize, and they're on my meetings a lot. I have a lot of my team on my meetings, and I get to do a lot of the talking. They do a ton of the hard work. We've all worked closely together for almost 3 years and kind of figured out where our different paranoias are, and they seem to all be covered. We have a really big team environment. So I know Director Draskovich, it's kind of fun to see because obviously I was in his role prior to going into mine, and I used to live in a paranoid state, and now David's in it. So it's nice to see. I'm kidding. But David worked really, really hard with his team on this. Obviously, Jen is instrumental with the SPED and Fed side and then the student count. So it takes the whole team to do this. And David's put together a really, really good team, and I feel really confident with our team. So it is not me that just sees the numbers alone. So usually they're saying, Scott, did you think about this? Did you think about this? So we just appreciate the opportunity we've had to put together a good team.
you share the nights when each one sees? You see it on Monday, Tuesday. He looks at it on Wednesday, Thursday at night, and Friday, Saturday. I'm just kidding.
No, I think we all see it all 7 days a week, each of us. So,
But thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, and then we'll see you on Monday, next Monday, right?
Yep. And any questions you have, feel free to reach out.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Next on the agenda, we have school board reports, and we have District Administrative Assistant Amy Geis, who is also the district election clerk, who will give an election update. Amy.
Good evening, school board and Dr. Anderson. Yes, I have the privilege of coming to you tonight in my capacity as our school board election clerk. Kind of as Scott had mentioned, and as you referred to earlier, this is purely informational. This is not anything that needs to be decided on, certainly not this evening. But I did want to give you some food for thought and to let you have an open discussion once I kind of lay out the information before you. So kind of prompted this was the state legislature on January 30th had before it a bill that is proposing that all odd year elections, both school board and city elections, are moved to even years. Their kind of precipice for this was the low voter turnout, but certainly there are other factors involved. So you can read through the bill there, and I know you've had this presentation before you. Currently, there are 25 of the 331 districts. I know you like percentages, so that puts us at 7.5% of the school boards throughout the state currently still have odd year elections. Some of them also coincide with their local city elections, so I don't have the exact numbers on which ones do or don't, but that certainly makes it easier from a financial perspective that they have their cities running them, not their school districts. I did highlight the District 4, MSBA District 4 districts that are still in the odd year, and I also noted the districts that are currently in discussion or considering moving to even year. I know on the next slide, you'll see the ones that have moved recently. Inver Grove Heights is planning on moving their elections to even years on their meeting in March 10th. And Richfield, I don't have the date for their March meeting, but they're also considering moving to even year. So the wave is kind of moving in that direction for lots of different reasons for these districts. So odd year election districts that recently moved are listed below. I did note on all of them which ones moved and which option they went with. And the only ones that I found, they all extended their current school board terms by 1 year. That's an option that we'll lay out for you in a moment. Oh, sorry. I'm monitoring the slides, so I realized I'm not moving the slideshows as I'm talking. Sorry. Got 2 computers to monitor to make sure our stream is good. So the most recent election we had was in 2023. This is again just for the school board, kind of laying out the budget. We budgeted for about 60,000. We have increased our budget each time we've run an election, but our costs have also increased. They increased by about 15% with each election. So we would also anticipate that continuing as we move forward with odd year elections. So considerations in thinking about moving to even year elections. Certainly the school district and taxpayer costs associated with running our own election. Voter confusion, we have 10 cities that we service students in our district, but those people don't necessarily know where they vote on. It's different for odd year and even year elections. So we frequently have voters showing up at the wrong place, not knowing what it is that they're voting on, things of that nature. So that could clear up if they only have even year elections. Certainly the time that it takes away from other duties. Surrounding school districts are changing to even years. We are a resource. It's kind of a one-person show for those of us that have to run our own elections during odd years. And as those resources dwindle, there are fewer of us to bounce off ideas off of each other. I listed some of the election clerk duties that fall on my shoulders. This would just be transferred to our cities and counties should you consider moving to even year. So the even year election costs would decrease quite a bit. We would not have to do any of the duties listed. Neighboring districts, they average about $5,700, and that's certainly a rough estimate. Really what you end up paying for if you're piggybacking on other elections that are taking place is the ballot space that you occupy. So if you have 4 candidates running, it's certainly less than if you have 15. We have had Wayzata in the range of all of them, but it's very nominal fee. It's very small compared to having to, we spent almost $81,000, and I did just receive another bill that I mentioned, so that cost is actually $24 increased. So in no particular order, I'm just laying out the 3 options that are before you. The first option is that for the next 2 scheduled odd year elections, we change those terms for your seats to 3-year terms. They're currently always 4. So those that are running, we have 4 seats that are up for election in 2025. Sorry, 3, backwards. 3 seats up for election in 2025. Those would be for 3-year terms. And then the subsequent election in 2027, those 4 seats would also be on 3-year terms. That would force us into the even year cycle. We would have to run 2 more odd year elections, but it would just, I think, maybe be the most transparent option in my purview, but there's pluses and minuses to all of them. Option 2 would be to pass a resolution that extends current terms for all 7 board members by 1 year. That would immediately put us on an even year cycle. If this was done before July 1st of this year, then we would not run a 2025 election. It would immediately move to a 2026 and 2028 election. There's no requirement by any means to make any decision before July 1st, but if you want that to go into effect for this year, that's when we would need to make that decision and notify the county auditor. The third option is to stay the course. We just keep odd year elections and wait and see if the state passes legislation. Should they pass legislation this year, it wouldn't go into effect until January 2026 anyways. They have not specified what the transition plan would be, if they would dictate it or if they would give us an option at that point. It's possible that they could force it or not. And it's not just for school boards, it's also for local cities. So I know Minnetonka in particular, that we have students in Minnetonka, they're on odd year, and so not sure how it would affect them as well. So that's certainly an option to not do anything. So just a general timeline, obviously today I'm just sort of putting this in front of you. moving forward and pending your discussions and where you want to be, we could bring this up again in another work session after you've had a chance to think about what this means for you and where you might want to go or not go with this. So it could come up in any future work session. If the board were to want to move forward with making any change prior to July 1st, so that it would go into effect this year, that would have to be decided at our June board meeting. But again, that's only if that's the will of the board. There's no requirement to make any decision prior to that. Again, I got ahead of myself. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for you guys to discuss this amongst yourselves.
Thank you, Amy. Can we ask you questions if we have any? Okay, thank you. So just one thing I wanted to add here that, Amy put a slide here up for election considerations to take into account. This is for the school district, how it affects the cost, time, etc. But one of the reasons why the legislature, I believe, is looking at changing this is because of the low percentage of voting that happens in odd years when we have only the school board elections. That is a big difference when 80% of the voters go out to vote in even year elections when everybody else is running. But in our, when we run for school board during odd years, it drops down to precipitously to as low as 20, 25, and 30%. So that is one of the big reasons that they are looking at it as well. So, but that I don't know if that should consider, we should even think about that when we look at our options. But I just wanted to throw that out there. So any comments, any questions for Amy? Yeah, go ahead, Sheila.
Amy, I'd like to ask you, that $81,000, does that come out of the general fund?
I'm going to default to our finance chair for that one. I don't know what fund, I just turn in receipts.
I haven't looked specifically at that, full disclosure, but my assumption or guess would be that it absolutely does come out of the general fund, because I didn't think there's any sort of streamlined funding for that.
The cost issue for me seems like a really big reason to change.
Yeah, agree with you.
I think that, and thank you, Amy, for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I think it's good that board members are informed on this. I took the news that this bill had been introduced in a pretty unfortunate tone. I think that outstanding school districts make investments in excellence, and this is one of those investments that we are willing to foot the bill to ensure that our elections happen in a time when we're the only election on the agenda for the people in our district. We get an entire election cycle to ourselves here in Wayzata Public Schools, so families and students are able to have the important conversations about our district and the services it provides, whereas if we're folded in with an even-numbered years, we're folded in with the governor's race. Full disclosure, in a governor's race election year, school board issues really don't come to the forefront. In a presidential year, it's even more so. So I don't want us to be put in as an afterthought. I want what goes on in our district to be, first and foremost on people's minds. We've also heard arguments about turnout. By the time you get to the bottom of the ballot, which is where the school board election sits, turnout is not 75%. Oftentimes you're lucky if it's 50%. So I think what we have in Wayzata Schools is really good. We have 1 year where we can talk about our institutions. We can talk with our students and our teachers and how we provide for them the best we can and ensure excellence for each and every. So certainly I see there being kind of another option here where we take full advantage of our opportunity in a week, visiting with legislators to tell them, we don't want this. And that'll be my message to legislators that, there is another option, which is just to say, we're not going to go along with this. I look at the dollar amount that it costs. Yeah, that's a substantial amount of money. But I think it's worth it when you talk about the value from the conversations, the value from people being so engaged, versus showing up to vote in an election where it's other issues that take precedent. And when it comes to education, I don't think anything stands ahead of that.
First of all, thank you for answering all my questions. One quick question, and you mentioned towards the end of your presentation So let's say we decide to go on even years, but let's say the Minnetonka city election is odd years.
Sure.
So do we have to run anything by each of those cities, or how that will work?
No, so we just need to notify the county auditor that we're moving. There are other elections as national, state elections that take place. There are just a few cities that still run their own on odd years. We had this when, I always forget, I'm sorry, who left their seat? Cien, thank you. I always can't recall. We had a school board member leave, and so we had to run a special election. And the cities all ran that. They just, tacked us onto their ballots. We still have to go around, and I have to do my clerk duties of collecting our votes from each of them. But that's just within their election cycle. That's pretty standard for anything that would be added. And if I could just tack on to that question real quick, because Heidi had a great question that she sent me today. If we were to have a referendum, if we were to have other ballot questions that we pose, there is always the opportunity for us to run a special election 5 times a year. So if other things come up, we would still consider running an election. You can do it on the second Tuesday in February, April, May, August, and the second Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So for anything, if we had a seat vacate early, things of that nature, we could certainly still run the elections. It just wouldn't be our normal cycle.
Thank you.
Sure.
Amy, is there a cost difference, and you might not know this, and I should have asked you before, so you can answer it later, is there a cost difference between a referendum election versus a school board election in terms of our administration of it?
There is not.
Okay.
No. So we would have to have the exact same duties performed by election judges. All the equipment rented from the city of Plymouth is incredibly generous with their time and help with things of that nature. But no, we'd still have the early voting period is the same even for special elections. So,
okay, thank you.
Yes.
And Melinda, I asked this question to Amy in the email as well, but just wanted to get your perspective from MSBA standpoint. So one of the options is, extend the term. How does that go with voters? So if we were to go with the option where we are extending 1 year for all board members and just to get everybody on the even year without spending any taxpayer dollars, is there any policy, anything we have to worry about?
MSBA has not, I don't believe, as far as I know, they have not discussed that at all. What they have said is, and I believe Amy responded with that in that email, is MSBA's stance is that we should leave this to local control. Okay, if YZETA wants to do it during odd years, let them keep doing it. That's their stance. They are not for or against, but they are saying just leave it on local control. And other than that, I don't think I've seen anything as far as extending one from 4 years to 5 years or reducing from 4 to 3. That I don't think we have discussed that yet at all.
So do we have to get any, again, buy-in from MSBA, anything, or is it purely our decision?
I think it's our decision. Is that correct, Amy? Yeah.
That's correct. It's purely your decision. Actually, MSBA, because this has come up often enough, they were generously provided us the resolutions for either situation, what you choose to do.
Yeah.
And again, sorry, just to tack on, Heidi had asked about AMSD and what their position was. And Dr. Anderson and I just got an email while we were sitting here. Their response was in line with MSBA. They just would like it to be in our control and not be dictated by the state.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Valentina?
I also asked another school board member from another district, which already moved. Interesting enough, she gave us statistics that from MSBA that through many years, many school districts were still on odd years, yeah, and many chose to move to even years. And as for their school district, her answer was that, interesting enough, public, many of them were asking, finally, you did it. And also, amazingly, they didn't get pushback. That's the feedback I got from another school board member.
Yes, and that's the same that I've heard. My counterparts in other districts across the state that have all moved within, I'd say, I opened it up to like a 5 to 7 year period because several more had moved prior to COVID, and they were also surprised that there was very little voter resistance to their choice. It was more of an understanding.
Yeah, Sheila.
Just as some further information, when we did have the special election, just kind of in response to what you said, Dan, the amount of votes that school board members got again was less than everybody else on the ballot, but it was still significantly more than board members get on the odd year elections. I mean, just in total votes cast, it's significantly more when you have it with another election. I mean, I'm just guessing here. I don't have any data or I haven't talked to anybody, but I'm guessing that voters, it's a cost of time to have to go and vote. And we're asking our, community to come in an odd year when they wouldn't be doing it for any other, election. So they might actually appreciate having it at the same time as everything else. They might, even though you want to have the board topics, more salience, I think you would still have that. The people, we might even get more attention paid because, again, people are already looking at other, candidates, and then they'll see that there are board members on their ballot, and they will then learn more because they're going there anyway. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with Sheila. In fact, I have specifically heard that from community members that why are you not on the same cycle? Because inherently everybody does their research and it's another category, another candidate versus going through that whole experience when there is nothing else going on. So I completely agree with you. And when you put cost per election, so I was surprised, and you can see based on my email, the questions that I was asking, $100,000 give and take for special election, in my mind, makes no sense.
Amy, is it possible for you, I don't want to add to your workload, but is it possible for you to, before our next work session, just put a table of numbers that voted in the odd year for our school board versus the following even year and last 5-6 years or 5-6 elections, so that we can look at those numbers actually, for a fact, right? Which numbers were better and which were not better. So
Certainly, yes. My predecessor kept that data, and I kept it as well. So
okay, so
that is not asking for much additional work. I can
okay,
put that
we'd
table
appreciate
together.
that. Thank you. All right, so I have one question. Are all these options assuming that the legislature will pass the bill or assuming that it will not pass the bill?
No, all of these options are just options before you.
So
it has nothing to do with the state. That's a giant question mark, is if the state were to move forward and pass this cycle and put us into a January 2026, they just say they would force us into transition, and it's very unclear as to what the transition would look like from the state.
And the reason I asked that is if you can go to option 1, if you can bring that up, please.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say that the legislature passes,
Sure.
or the bill passes. Bullet number 325, we will be doing our election this year in November, but 27 will not be possible, right?
So it could be. Unfortunately, again, without knowing what the state would decide on, I can't quite predict that. I did have this conversation specifically with Greg Abbott from MSBA because I had the same question, and he said that he's under the impression that should we already be in transition, that the state would let us finish out our transition.
Exactly.
But again, that's just his impression, and he also agrees they could just force us onto even year. So
it is possible that those who ran and are sitting at this board table in 2023, they will be up for re-election based on that in 2027. And even if the legislature has passed that, approved the bill, they might still allow us to have these candidates or, who runs in 27 run in that year.
That is, yes, that is possible. I believe that Director Genestra voiced his concern that it is also possible they could remove a year from that group that was just elected in 2023. The state legislature has that power, so
Okay.
it's possible.
Okay.
Either way.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll find out. May 19th, I believe, is when the session ends, and I don't know, maybe a week or so before the governor signs the bills, but it will be before our June meeting for sure. Go ahead, Sheila.
So assuming that the state doesn't doesn't change it if we decide to do something, the options before us would affect all board members equally. Either we lose a year or we gain a year, just to make that clear, unless
Yep.
the state says, oh, you're in transition and we don't care. Is that, okay.
So what are our next steps? Because I think, again, that June timeline is directional. That gives us, a couple of months. So do we want to wait until certain things passes on the legislation side, then bring it back to work session, and then bring it back to voting? Like, what are our next steps?
I don't think we have to wait for this thing to be approved or not approved. We can have a work session in April to discuss this even further. I don't know how much more we'll discuss, but if we do need to, I think we can, and be prepared for both scenarios, right? And so you had recommended some work sessions, right, Amy?
Yes, I figured after this discussion, perhaps you would want to, again, think on what your options are and certainly decide and maybe come forward at an agenda planning and decide if you want to have this at another work session.
But you are saying that we have to decide one way or the other by the June board meeting, correct?
No. If you want this to affect the current year, the 2025 election, it would need to get voted on by June.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I meant. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I need clarification. So this extending 1 year, it means extending to all of us, correct? So instead of 4, we'll be serving 5.
Correct. That would affect everyone on the board.
Another option is actually going to be affecting future elected members, am I right? Not us.
That's correct. It would be affecting the 3-year term would be for those that opt to run in 2025 and 2027. So yes, you are correct. That is.
So it's not.
It's only you if you were elected in it during those years. Yes.
And more clarification. My understanding is quite a bit who moved to even years. They did extend 1 year. Am I right?
That's correct. I have not found a district that chose to have 2 more odd year elections. I'm sure that it exists. I just have not found it at this point. Everyone that has done it in the last, like I said, 5 to 7 years that I've spoken with, they've all chosen to extend the current term for 1 year.
The only thing I feel like how are the optics, how our people are looking at extending your own serving for 1 year. It's kind of, if it would have known upfront, for example, when you're running, then that you get 5 here because of that, it is one thing. And extending your own, it sounds like that is a little bit.
It'll probably be as difficult or as easy as asking for a tech levy renewal, right? You have to convince, right, the community, I suppose, that we are doing this for a specific reason. Obviously, it's not like we woke up one day and we said we will extend board members' duration to 5 years. Obviously, you have to give a reason. You have to give a reason for that, right?
Yeah. And I agree with other school districts if they have gone with that option, because it's very clear, why would I spend close to $100,000, so $200,000 on 2 elections just to move it 5 years from now? So I totally agree why they went down that path. But that's where my question was, are there any legal implications in terms of extending the term? But if it is not, then I completely agree with other school districts.
Okay. All right, so if there are no more questions, again, like Amy said, we can have board work sessions before our final decision. And let me know if what you think. If you think we need one, maybe two board sessions or work sessions, we can certainly have those before the vote, I guess. So thank you, everyone. All right, this completes our work session for this evening. The next school board regular board meeting will be a week from today on Monday, March 10th. The time is now 5:50. The Wayzata Public Schools Board of Education work session for Monday, March 3rd, 2025 is adjourned.